My name is Commander Avery Lockhart. I'm 39 years old. I served 16 years in the United States Navy as a propulsion systems engineer. I didn't come from power, I was born into it. But I was never handed respect. I had to earn every ounce of it in silence. This morning, I walked into Hangar 12 at Kitsap Naval Base, called in as a civilian consultant under emergency protocol. The air was thick with failure. Every technician looked tired. Every screen was blinking warnings. A Barracuda-class submarine just weeks away from active deployment had suffered a critical engine failure. The room was filled with engineers' top minds in naval engineering, and none of them had fixed it. And then I stepped in. I hadn't set foot on that floor in 3 years. The last time I was here, I was being escorted out silently accused of an engineering oversight I didn't commit. My badge had been revoked, my clearance stripped, and the man who signed the paper that ended my career. He was standing right there, Commander Thomas Lockhart, my father. He turned the moment he saw me walk in. The room fell into a hush just for a second. Then he laughed. Loud, sharp, condescending. He pointed at me and barked, "Who let her in?" A few younger techs chuckled nervously. One of them leaned over and whispered, not quietly enough. "That's his daughter, right?" "Not anymore," another replied. I said nothing. I just kept walking toward the turbine casing, toward the place where I knew the flaw must live. It was like hearing an old song again, but all the notes were wrong. The control panel's rhythm was off. The diagnostic flow didn't match what I had designed. But before I could speak, the door behind me slid open. She walked in. Admiral Geneva Parks, short, sharp, and steel-eyed. The room stiffened. Even my father straightened his back. She didn't look at anyone else. She looked straight at him, and in a voice calm and cutting she said, "Actually, she is the original designer." The silence was absolute. You could hear the electrical hum in the wall. My father's face drained of color, and in that moment, standing in my boots, holding the same toolkit they took from me 3 years ago, I knew exactly why I was here. Not to fix a machine, to fix a truth. I should have been angry, but instead I stood still, completely still, and waited. This wasn't just a room full of broken steel. It was the same room that broke me. And now it was the same place where the truth began to bend back toward me. You want to know what happened. You want to know why the engine failed, why they called me in, why my father turned pale in front of his own men. Let's go back, 3 years back, before the dishonor, before the silence, before the whisper that ruined everything I built. Let me show you how I got here and why I didn't just come back to repair an engine. I came back to reclaim something that should have never been taken. I've been in war rooms inside cold steel vessels and under pressure that could crush a spine. But nothing felt as suffocating as the silence after my father's voice cracked across the hangar. Who let her in? He hadn't changed. Not in posture, not in tone. Still the officer who believed control came from volume. Still the father who never saw me as more than an extension of his legacy, until I started building one of my own. But this wasn't about him, not yet. I didn't respond. I kept walking until I reached the primary diagnostic table. The turbine's outer casing was open, its core still intact. That was my design. Even with every bolt stripped bare, I recognized its balance. A small group of engineers stood near the control terminal, eyes bouncing between me and the Admiral, trying to figure out which protocol to follow, military hierarchy or ego. That's when he stepped forward, Chief Engineer Watkins. Square jaw, polished boots, and the confident smirk of a man who thought he had nothing to prove. He looked young, sharp, one of those engineers who read specs better than people. I could tell from the way he carried his badge, like it weighed more than his work. "I'm sorry," he said, blinking at me as if seeing something he didn't expect. "Are you Commander Lockhart?" I nodded once. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're the designer of this system." I said, "before it was approved for integration." He tilted his head. "I thought you were removed from the project. Something about a failure during prototyping, a safety risk." Behind me, I heard someone shift awkwardly. My father didn't correct him. I met Watkins' gaze and answered simply, "Not removed. I resigned." He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Right, of course." A few engineers smirked. One even chuckled under his breath. I recognized that kind of laugh. I used to do it too when I was younger, when I didn't understand what people carried into a room. Watkins turned to his team. Well, thanks to that resignation, we've had to reverse engineer half the control logic. You didn't need to, I replied. The documentation was complete when I left. Then maybe you can help us understand why we're 32 hours into diagnostics and still no closer to isolating the malfunction, he snapped. I'd like to review the current blueprint, I said, walking toward the master console, the one your team is working from. Watkins crossed his arms but didn't stop me. He gave a slight nod to one of the techs. The screen lit up system schematics and live telemetry data. I scanned the interface. My eyes traced every node, every pressure valve path, every control feedback loop. It looked like my system at first. Then I saw it. Line 42. The safety bypass protocol. It had been moved. Line 113. The coolant regulator's heat threshold. Raised by 3.5 degrees Celsius. And then I saw the footer of the blueprint. A timestamp. Modified 1 year 7 months ago. Approved by Commander T. Lockhart. I stared at it, jaw clenched. He stood 3 feet behind me. He knew I'd find it. Watkins stepped closer, frowning. What I didn't answer right away. I pointed to the changes. These aren't part of the original design, I said. They're optimizations, Watkins countered. We adjusted thresholds for faster startup response. Minor tuning. No, I said quietly. These changes distort the safety envelope. They increase stress at mid-cycle and throw off rotor balance under sustained load. That's why your diagnostics fail after 90 seconds. Do you have proof? Watkins challenged. I turned my head slightly. Yes. The proof is in the original blueprint, the one that's no longer in your system. I could feel the weight of every stare now. Some curious, some skeptical, 1 or 2 starting to believe. I stood up from the console. I'd like access to the unaltered design, I said calmly. Before the edits were made, Watkins hesitated. Then he looked at my father. Thomas shook his head once. Watkins looked back at me. I'm afraid we don't have it, he said. Only the approved revision. That's standard protocol. Then I'll work from memory, I said. Because what you're looking at isn't my engine. It's a ghost of it. The room went quiet. And this time it wasn't because I walked in. It was because I wasn't leaving. I didn't make a scene. I didn't demand access in front of the room. When I left the hangar, I walked quietly toward the back corridors through the belly of the base, where memory lives in metal and dust. I still remembered the route. Past the calibration bay, down the service ramp. 3rd door on the left, the archive room. Technically, it wasn't off limits, but no one spent time down here unless they were chasing ghosts or hiding them. The lights flickered on overhead as I entered, revealing rows of data terminals, shelves of box schematics, and a fine layer of neglect. I found the console tied to Barracuda-class diagnostic logs and keyed in the restricted search. My clearance pinged yellow. I bypassed it manually. Most of the system data had been sanitized, only redacted summaries. But buried in a side folder labeled Auxiliary Reports were the raw entries, line item data maintenance memos, heat signature anomalies, things only someone who knew what to look for would ever find. I pulled up the maintenance logbook from the week of the engine failure, the test that got me buried. Entry 2387. Sensor drift reported on coolant manifold. Minor, cleared. Entry 2390. Thermal rise in chamber 3 during idle phase. Flagged. No action. Entry 2391. Alarm triggered at 92 seconds. Overridden manually. Manual override. Why that wasn't protocol. I scrolled faster, my fingers tense. The logbook kept flagging the same pattern: rising heat, out of sync balance overrides, issued with no notations. On paper, everything looked under control. But anyone who knew my design would recognize the one thing that didn't belong. The alarm sequence. I had programmed a unique cascade 6 stages escalating alerts designed to detect even subtle destabilization in rotor equilibrium. It was one of my proudest features. And it was gone. The system had been rewritten to issue a 2-stage generic warning standard protocol. Faster, simpler, cheaper, but far less precise. I leaned closer to the screen. There it was. Change authorized by CMDR T. Lockhart. Date 17 months ago. Just weeks before the test. He'd signed off on the alarm alteration. Not just approved it, he initiated it. I sat back. My throat was dry. I closed my eyes and remembered the hearing. How they said I failed to implement a reliable safety structure. How no one mentioned that the most important line of defense, the one that could have saved the test, had been stripped away. Was that the moment they decided to use me as the scapegoat? Or was it just easier to bury the design and promote the revision? I opened another file: engineering session notes, meeting records, amendment justifications. None of them mentioned me, not once. I read a note from a junior tech written days after the failure. System seemed to escalate too late. Rotor had already destabilized before alert sounded. Notified supervisor. Logged and closed. Like it didn't matter, like it never happened. The more I read, the more it felt intentional. Not just a mistake, a strategy. Strip down the parts that required experience. Simplify the logic to accommodate contractors. Shift responsibility. Claim progress. It wasn't about my failure, it was about their comfort. Because my design demanded too much of them. And when it failed, or when they made it fail, they needed a name to carry the weight. And they picked mine. I leaned forward again. Found the last system checkpoint, timestamped 24 hours before the incident. Final sign-off: CMDR T. Lockhart. My father had signed the last clearance, every altered function, every erased safeguard. I didn't know what hurt more, that he did it, or that he never told me he had. I copied the entries onto a portable drive, locked the terminal, and stood up. As I left the archive room, I passed a mirror mounted on the back of the steel door. I didn't recognize the reflection, not because I'd aged, but because for the first time I saw myself not as someone who'd lost something, but as someone who was taken from, and now I wanted it back. By the time I left the archive room, the sky outside had begun to gray. The sun, barely past noon, felt like it was setting early, like it couldn't bear to watch what was unfolding inside these walls. I didn't go back to the hangar, not yet. Instead, I walked to Control Bay 3, where subsystem schematics and flow models were stored for internal review. The place had once been my second home. Now it looked different. Brighter lights, colder chairs, a new digital console that hummed just a little too loud. I requested access to the fluid dynamics schematic for the Barracuda's propulsion assembly. The tech on duty gave me a confused glance, then typed in the override manually. "Be careful," he said. "Those files have been touched a lot. People keep making adjustments." Touched. That was one word for it. I opened the system flowchart and pulled up the diagram I knew best. The reverse thruster coolant loop. This was the core of the system's heartbeat. In my design, every part flowed like breath. Inhale, exhale, forward momentum, lateral thrust, and when needed, a clean reversal sequence that never compromised internal pressure. But something looked off. I stared at the pathway for over a minute before I realized what had changed. The reversal valve had been moved by 3 inches, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. But for a high-pressure closed-loop system, it was everything. The valve was now upstream pre-chamber, meaning the system would receive surge pressure before stabilizing coolant levels. At high RPMs, that created cavitation pockets, unpredictable stress zones. The kind that didn't show up in slow diagnostics. But in live deployment, that mistake was a time bomb. I checked the edit log. Proposal submitted 18 months ago. Approved by Commander T. Lockhart. Again. That made 3 critical changes, all tied to him. The alarm structure, the thermal thresholds, and now the heart of the flow system itself. I stood in silence. My hands hovered over the console, afraid that touching it again would break me. I didn't need to say it out loud. I knew what it meant. Someone didn't just edit my work. They reconstructed it, bit by bit, and then let it fail. The console flickered. I backed away. Behind me, an old laminated board hung on the wall, left over from the early days of the Barracuda project. My original hand-drawn schematic still clung to it, corners yellowing, lines fading. I walked over, traced my finger along the main coolant loop. The reversal valve was still in the right place, exactly where it had been meant to live. And then I saw it. A black marker line. Someone had scratched out the valve position. Drew a new arrow upstream, in a different pen, different style. But the handwriting, it was his. Neat, precise. Block letters with the slight upward tilt he always used when writing numbers. I used to imitate that style as a girl on birthday cards, school papers, even tool labels. Now it stared back at me as proof, not of intention, but of ownership. He had touched this, personally. I pulled up a chair and sat, alone. No screens, no voices. Just the laminated ghost of a system I once gave everything to. I wanted to feel rage, but what came over me was colder, a stillness, a sinking understanding that I hadn't just been removed from my own design. I had been erased, and not by a stranger, by someone who knew exactly what each line meant, someone who knew exactly what would happen when you bent pressure against its natural flow. My father didn't just walk away from me 3 years ago. He walked deeper into the system I built and rewired it in his name. Maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe he thought he was fixing a design too ambitious for its own good. But when the engine failed, he let them say it was me. I looked again at the black mark over my valve, and I made a quiet promise. I would restore every inch of this system. And when I was done, everyone would know exactly who changed the heart. I didn't ask for permission. After what I found in the flow schematic, there was no point in chasing system access or waiting for formal clearance. I didn't need their files. I had everything I needed up here in my head, etched from years of revision correction and sleepless nights debugging a system I knew more intimately than I've known most people. So I found an empty diagnostics bay, pulled the cover off a whiteboard, grabbed a marker, and began to draw. No fanfare, no explanation. Just the slow, steady return of a design that had never actually failed, only been misunderstood then betrayed. The first thing I sketched was the coolant vector loop, the spine of the propulsion architecture. Then the turbine chamber buffering zones, each one carefully spaced for pressure stability. After that, the reverse thrust dampeners, the exhaust redistribution ducts, and the 6-phase alarm cascade. Each element surfaced like muscle memory resurfacing, not with hesitation but certainty. I wasn't improvising. I was remembering. Behind me, I could hear whispers. Someone had noticed what I was doing. But I didn't turn around. I added the tolerances, pressure differentials, heat coefficients, every parameter down to the millisecond delay of the emergency cutoff. There was no shaking in my hand, no doubt. When I was finished, I stepped back. My shirt was damp with sweat. Not from stress, from focus. Watkins walked in. I didn't hear him at first, but I saw his reflection in the window. He stood just inside the door, arms crossed. "You doing this for show?" he asked. I turned to face him. "No. I'm doing it because none of you have seen the real design." He walked closer, brows raised. "This is your original schematic." I nodded. "This is what the engine was supposed to be, before it was reworked." He studied the board slower now. His fingers traced one loop, then another. "But this doesn't match our current logic. Our model has the reversal valve here," he pointed. "And your heat alarms were removed," I said flatly. He blinked. "And the system thresholds elevated without testing. And the backup cascade was disabled." He didn't speak right away. Then, "That's not in any of our documentation." "I know," I replied. "Because someone erased it. And no one questioned why." I walked over and handed him a drive. "This contains the maintenance logs, modification records, and manual overrides I found. All time-stamped. All signed off." He took it, hesitating. "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone," I said. "I'm trying to stop the next failure before someone gets hurt." He glanced down at the whiteboard again. "You really built this whole system from scratch?" "Not from scratch," I said. "From belief. I believed we could make something better, something quieter, more efficient, but not by cutting corners or simplifying complexity." He nodded once. The cockiness had faded. Now he just looked thoughtful. A small group of engineers had gathered in the hallway. I could see their faces through the glass, curious, cautious, and watching. I turned back to the board, pointed to the coolant margin ratio near the core chamber. This is where the failure started. In the revised design surge, pressure exceeds containment thresholds at 92 seconds. Watkins checked the log on his tablet. "That's exactly when we lose rotor stability." I said nothing. "Why hasn't anyone caught this?" he muttered. "Why didn't we run these comparisons?" I let the silence answer that for him. "Because it's easier to believe a system is broken than to admit you broke it. And because the name on the blueprint wasn't one they respected, it was one they buried." He looked back up at me. Can you run a simulation with this configuration? I can run it from memory, I said. But I'll need a live rig. And silence. He looked unsure. I added, or you can keep guessing until this failure turns into a casualty. That was enough. He turned and walked out. I knew he'd get the clearance. I sat down, stared at the whiteboard one more time. This wasn't a protest. This wasn't a plea. It was a resurrection. Of the design. Of my name. Of the truth. And I wasn't here to convince anyone. I was here to show them what they never really looked at. The simulation room was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the steel walls, or maybe it was the way people watched me like I was a relic of something inconvenient. But I didn't flinch. I just stood beside the test rig, while the team loaded my original parameters into the system. Watkins hovered near the door, arms crossed again. He hadn't said much since he passed my request up the chain. But I could feel the skepticism radiating off him. The room darkened slightly as the test chamber sealed. Hydraulics hissed, screens lit up. Every engineer on the floor turned their eyes to the monitors. No one spoke. That's when Admiral Geneva Parks entered. Calm, composed. She nodded to Watkins, then to me. You're cleared to proceed, she said. Run the simulation as requested. Watkins muttered something under his breath. I caught part of it. Let's see if the ghost can dance. I ignored him. Begin phase 1, I instructed. The operator tapped the console. The simulated Barracuda propulsion system came to life. Pressure valves clicked. Coolant flowed. Power surged through the virtual chamber. For the first 60 seconds, the numbers held steady. And then, the alarms began. Not mine, theirs. The system began rejecting my parameters. Red alerts, thermal inconsistencies, rotor synchronization errors. The screen flashed, critical deviation detected. Emergency abort recommended. People stirred. I heard whispers. Watkins stepped forward, a smug smile creeping in. Well, that didn't take long. But I raised my hand calmly. Pause the test, I said. Do not abort. Do not reset. The operator hesitated. Looked at the Admiral. Proceed, she ordered. I moved to the panel. Quickly adjusted the coolant delay rate by half a second. Lowered the heat threshold curve by 1.7%. Manually synced the rotor buffer timing with the original cascade sequence. The system whined, objecting. Then it hesitated. Then it stabilized. The alarms vanished one by one. Red turned to amber. Amber faded to green. The room grew still. I stepped back. Resume. The operator looked uncertain, but he followed orders. The simulated engine spun again. This time cleaner, sharper. By the 90-second mark, the same point every previous test had failed, my configuration held. Temperature remained within tolerance. Rotor alignment was exact. Thrust pressure was uniform. Watkins stared at the monitor. His arms dropped. His voice was quiet now. I don't understand. Our model couldn't survive past 75 seconds. That's because your model wasn't built to survive, I said. It was built to meet a deadline. Someone behind me murmured, she's right. Another whispered, did we ever test this configuration before? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The data spoke louder than I ever could. The Admiral turned to Watkins. Did you adjust any of the valve positions in your build? Yes, he admitted. We made some changes for startup efficiency. I looked at him. You optimized performance by sacrificing stability. That's not engineering, that's gambling. He looked away. I turned to the board and tapped the final telemetry reading. This isn't perfection, it's balance. Machines don't care about timelines, they care about truth. You either build with it or you break everything trying to fake it. The simulation ended. Success. 100% cycle completion. No critical errors, no collapse. No one clapped. But no one moved either. Because for the first time since I returned, they weren't waiting for me to fail. They were waiting for what I would do next. I looked over at Admiral Parks. She didn't smile, she didn't nod. She just met my eyes and said, run it again. Independent review. Witnesses from the Pentagon's engineering division. I nodded. She added quietly. And this time, we archived the right version. I stepped back from the panel. The room felt lighter, but I knew better than to celebrate. The system had stabilized, but the people inside it still fractured. I wasn't done. This was proof. But justice would need more, and I intended to get it. It was past midnight when my phone rang. I was alone in the temporary quarters Admiral Parks had arranged 4 concrete walls, no windows, and a cot that creaked when I sat down. I hadn't expected rest. Not after what I'd proven in the simulation hours earlier. The system had survived. My design had survived. But that wasn't closure. It was just the crack that let the truth begin to leak out. I didn't recognize the number on the screen. It was unlisted. No ID, but something told me to answer. Lockhart, I said, keeping my voice even. There was silence for a second. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years. Avery? It's Mason. Mason Ortega. I froze. Mason had been a propulsion analyst during the final testing phase of the Barracuda prototype. Quiet, brilliant. Always 2 steps ahead of the rest of the room and 3 steps behind in getting credit. He disappeared right after I left. I assumed he'd walked away from the mess like I did, but clearly he hadn't gone far. Mason, I breathed. Where the hell have you been watching, he said, waiting for someone to look deeper. I saw the news about your return, the test, the stabilization. That was you, wasn't it? I didn't answer. He took my silence for confirmation. He exhaled. I should have called you sooner. Why now? I asked. Because you're finally close enough to the truth, he replied. I sat up alert. What truth? He hesitated. I was in the room when they finalized the system for the live prototype. You weren't there. They told us you'd signed off on the revisions. But something felt wrong. My pulse quickened. I never signed anything, I said. Not after my last revision. I know, Mason replied. I dug through the logs 2 days later. I found your name on the config approval, but the signature line. It didn't match the time code on your clearance. Someone had logged in under your profile, after you'd been locked out. My throat went dry. You're telling me someone forged my credentials? Not exactly, he said. They used administrative override. They didn't forge your name, they just replaced your authority. I clenched my jaw. And who approved the override? Silence. Then Commander T. Lockhart. I closed my eyes. It wasn't new information, but hearing it confirmed. Hearing it from someone who was there. It hit different. Mason wasn't done. That alone would have been bad. But the worst part, I found a second override. The night before the propulsion failure. Someone deleted the auto-logging sequence from the alarm system. That's why no one could trace the breakdown after the crash. There were no records. And you're sure of this? I asked. Yes. I made a copy of the event log. But when I brought it up, I was told to stop chasing shadows. 2 days later, my contract wasn't renewed. And you didn't say anything, he paused. I didn't think anyone would believe me. You were already gone. The Admiralty had signed off on the report. And your father, he carried weight, Avery, more than you knew. I stood and paced the room, hand over my mouth. How long have you had that file? 3 years, he said. Encrypted. I've been sitting on it, waiting for someone to come back. He paused. You were always the one who fought for the truth. I couldn't carry it on my own. My hand trembled slightly. I need that file, Mason. I figured you would, he said. I just sent it to the drive you used in the simulation room. Download it, verify it, and use it however you need. There was a pause, then one final thing. Avery. I'm sorry I stayed silent. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Silence only matters when it stays that way, I said. We ended the call. I sat down and stared at the wall. 3 years, 3 years of disgrace. All built on a system that had been twisted behind closed doors, rewritten under my name and buried in the silence of fear. But no more. I wasn't just rebuilding a design. I was building a case. And now I had evidence. This wasn't a question of engineering anymore. It was a question of accountability. And I intended to deliver the answer. I found him alone just after dusk in the upper briefing room, where the walls were still lined with framed commendations and silver-engraved models of ships he'd once overseen. He was leaning over a report, pen in hand, just like I remembered. He didn't look up when I entered, but he knew I was there. He always did. I didn't knock. I didn't ask if it was a good time. I just walked to the center of the room and waited. Finally, he glanced up. You're not supposed to be here after hours, he said. Voice flat. I know, I replied. Neither was the override request. His face didn't move. not even a flicker. I placed the data drive on the table between us. That's every log Mason recovered, I said. Every override. Every deleted alarm event. Every system altered under my name. Still nothing. Not even a shift in his chair. I read through the manual overrides. I read the approval logs. And the one thing I couldn't stop seeing over and over again was your name. I kept my voice low, steady, no heat, just truth. He stared at the drive but didn't touch it. You signed the final clearance the night before the failure, I said. Not because you had to. Because you chose to. He finally looked at me, but not with anger. Not with shame, just weight. Like the words had been sitting on his chest, waiting to crush him. I'm not here to humiliate you, I said. I just want to hear you say it, out loud. I stepped closer, stared him straight in the eyes, and asked the question that had haunted me for 3 years. Why did you sign off on the report that blamed me? The air between us held its breath. He lowered the pen, folded his hands, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to speak at all. But then quietly he did. I didn't think they would use it to push you out, he said. My stomach clenched. I stepped back. You knew the system was altered. I knew the engineers were nervous about your design, he continued. Said it was too advanced, too sensitive, that it wouldn't hold under real-world pressure. And instead of defending it, you rewrote it. I streamlined it, he said. I thought I was helping, smoothing the rough edges. I shook my head. You changed the very bones of it. And when it failed, you let them pin it on me. He looked away. I was told the board just needed a name. That it would blow over, that you'd be reassigned. I didn't know they'd take your clearance, erase your access, end your commission. I stepped around the table and sat across from him. I didn't raise my voice, didn't point fingers. Then what did you think they'd do, Dad? When you gave them exactly what they needed to bury me, what did you think would happen? He didn't answer. Not right away. Then barely above a whisper, he said, I was scared. There it was, not an excuse, not a justification, just a broken truth. A simple, hollow human truth. I saw them turning, he said. Saw how quickly they'd weaponize blame. I thought if I could take the pressure off by simplifying your design, they'd leave you alone. But I underestimated how ready they were to sacrifice someone. And you were the easiest target. You knew they wouldn't question a Lockhart signature, I said. He nodded. I thought my name would protect you. I leaned forward. No. You thought your name would protect you. He swallowed hard, said nothing. For a long moment we sat in silence. 2 engineers, 2 Lockharts, 2 architects of the same machine. Only one of us had been willing to live with its consequences. You didn't just write me out of the project, I said. You wrote my failure. He finally looked at me. This time with eyes not of a commander, but a father. A father who knew there was no apology that could rewrite what had already been recorded in silence and shame. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. But it did, I replied. I stood up, took the drive with me. You don't need to say you're sorry, I said. You just need to understand. I'm not asking for your permission anymore. As I walked toward the door, he called after me. Avery, I paused. When this goes public, you'll hurt people. I turned back, met his gaze. So did you. And then I walked out. I submitted the report just before sunrise. Every page had been cross-referenced, time-stamped, and annotated with supporting logs. Mason's event file, the override history, the maintenance logs that never made it to the formal review. Even the original blueprint with my initials dated 3 years ago. Untouched, unbroken. I didn't attach a cover letter. I didn't add a request for reinstatement. This wasn't a petition, it was a record. And records don't beg. By noon, I received the summons. Internal Technical Review Hearing. Classified Tier 3 location. Kitsap Naval Command Room 4B attendees. Engineering Oversight Board witnesses and involved personnel. My hands were steady when I walked into the room. My boots echoed across the tiled floor like they belonged there again. The room was small, circular, without windows. 5 members of the Oversight Board sat behind a raised desk, flanked by 2 military advisors. To the right, Watkins stood stiffly in a dress uniform. To the left, Admiral Geneva Parks. And just beyond the panel, 1 seat left, empty, Thomas Lockhart's. The chair wasn't just vacant. It had a nameplate already turned down. The presiding officer spoke first. "Commander Lockhart," she said, using my title for the first time in years, "this hearing has been convened to address inconsistencies surrounding the propulsion failure logged during the Barracuda prototype trial 3 years ago. You've submitted new documentation. We're prepared to hear your findings." I didn't thank her. I didn't smile. I opened the folder in my hands and began. I walked them through the sequence log by log, change by change. How the warning systems had been downgraded. How the valve placement had been altered. How my credentials were overwritten and my design restructured. I kept my tone clear, detached, almost clinical. I knew they didn't want drama. They wanted data. So I gave it to them. With precision. At one point, one of the engineers interrupted. "Are you suggesting this board accepted a flawed configuration knowingly?" "No," I answered. "I'm suggesting you were given a version that removed the name of the one who built it. That version performed exactly as it was designed to, just not by me." Watkins shifted behind me. He looked down, didn't speak. When I was finished, I stepped back. The presiding officer turned to Admiral Parks. "Do you corroborate these findings?" "I do," she said firmly. "And I verified the digital signatures on each override. They align with Commander Lockhart's claims." Then she added, "For the record, and the modifications were approved under the authority of Commander Thomas Lockhart. He has since submitted a formal withdrawal from this board's proceedings." The room fell silent for a moment. Then the lead advisor cleared his throat. "We've reviewed your documentation. There's no evidence of technical failure in your original system. The breakdown occurred due to unauthorized alterations, none of which were reflected in the final report." He paused. "In light of this, the original engineering failure report will be amended. The record will show that Commander Avery Lockhart's propulsion design was structurally sound and tampered with post-approval. All related responsibility for the malfunction will be reassigned." He looked me in the eye. "Your technical record has been cleared, Commander." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were factual, stamped, filed, real. The board dismissed the hearing. As the room emptied, Admiral Parks approached me. "You did what most wouldn't," she said. "You came back not to reclaim a rank, but a truth." I nodded. She handed me an envelope. "Your clearance has been restored, fully retroactive." I took it. Not for what it symbolized, but for what it corrected. I left the room alone, no applause, no congratulations. Just the quiet satisfaction of the record being right, finally. Outside, the wind was cold again. The same wind I walked into 3 years ago. Only this time I wasn't walking away with shame. I was walking forward with proof. And sometimes proof is all you need to close a wound that never should have existed in the first place. You'd think that when a name is cleared, people would rush to celebrate. But that's not how truth works in a place like this. After the hearing, I didn't go back to the barracks or the simulation room. I walked the long hallway outside Hangar 12 instead, slowly, deliberately, my boots echoing against concrete that had once swallowed my silence. The corridor was quiet, dimly lit, but not empty. As I reached the far end, I heard footsteps behind me. Light, hesitant. I turned and saw 3 engineers. Young, sharp, and awkward in that way people get when they're about to say something they should have said sooner. They wore civilian-grade utility vests and carried clipboards they clearly weren't using. The one in front, a kid with sandy hair and nervous eyes, spoke first. "Commander Lockhart," I nodded. He glanced at the others, then back at me. "I just wanted to say something." I waited. "I used to think you only got the Barracuda project because of who your father was," he said. Not cruelly, just honestly. "Back when we studied the architecture in school, your name was on the first iteration. But then it disappeared and his was on the official version." I didn't respond. I'd heard worse. I'd survived worse. But after the hearing today, he swallowed hard. "Now I know. You didn't just design the engine. You understood it. Every part. Every line. And we've just been trying to operate something we didn't fully build." The other 2 engineers nodded. One of them, a young woman in a navy blue cap, added softly, "Your design saved the test. Not his name, not ours." I looked at all 3 of them. They weren't trying to flatter me. They weren't trying to fix what hadn't broken in me. They were just seeing me clearly for the first time. I could have said thank you. I could have brushed it off. Instead, I asked a question. "What did they teach you about failure?" They blinked. In class, I continued. What did they say failure looks like? The woman spoke again. When numbers don't match predictions. When results exceed tolerances. Wrong, I said. Failure isn't when things break. It's when we stop asking why they broke. It's when we accept someone else's silence instead of chasing the sound that got lost beneath it. The young man looked down. The truth was landing maybe for the first time in his life. Do you know what it cost me to get back into this hallway? I asked. They didn't answer. They didn't have to. It cost me every assumption people made about me. That I was protected. That I was promoted. That I was someone's daughter before I was someone's engineer. I stepped past them, but before I turned the corner, I looked back. I don't need your apology, I said. I need you to design better than I did. Ask more than I did. Demand proof before praise. And when something doesn't look right, especially when no one wants to talk about it, follow that silence until it tells you the truth. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there holding their clipboards like shields, as if they suddenly felt too small for the room they thought they owned. I walked on. The hallway narrowed the farther I went, and for the first time in years, I felt taller. Not because they respected me, but because I no longer needed them to. They would carry this moment longer than they expected. Not because I made them feel guilty, but because I made them feel responsible. And that's what legacy really is. Not applause, not headlines. Just a whisper in the hallway that changes the way someone builds the next thing they're trusted to touch. 3 weeks passed before I saw him again. By then I was back in Oregon, back in my shop, where the walls were lined with blueprints. Half-repaired turbine rotors and oil-stained notes, tacked up like reminders of who I used to be and who I chose to become. It was a Thursday afternoon. The rain had settled into that familiar rhythm against the tin roof, soft, persistent, like it didn't care who was listening. The shop bell rang. I didn't look up right away. I was teaching one of my students how to recalibrate a faulty pressure sensor, real work, not theoretical, the kind of work that grounds you. But when I did glance up, he was there, standing in the doorway like a shadow that didn't know where it belonged. Thomas Lockhart, my father. Still in uniform, though, I noticed the pins were gone from his collar. No rank, no shield, just the coat and the weight he carried inside it. He didn't say hello, didn't smile. Instead, he walked slowly across the room past the students who instinctively stepped aside and placed something down on my workbench. A metal box. Old, worn. The kind of box you keep your whole life, not because of what's inside, but because of what it used to mean. I knew that box. It was his personal toolkit, the one he never let me touch growing up. Not even once. He looked at it for a long second, then looked at me. I kept this too long, he said. But I never used it right. That was all. No long speech, no breakdown. Just those 2 sentences. I stared at the box, then at him. The room felt quieter than usual. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. I remember when I was 10, I said, and you caught me reaching for that torque wrench inside. You took the box and moved it to the top shelf. He nodded. You said it wasn't for me. I was wrong, he replied. I stepped closer. Not to embrace him, not to lecture him, just to stand in the space between us. A space we'd both carved open year after year in silence and assumption. I don't hate you, I said quietly. I wanted to, but I never did. He didn't answer, didn't try to offer excuses. I thought for a long time that if I proved I was smarter, faster, more precise, that one day you'd see me. I saw you, he said. I just didn't know what I was looking at. That hurt more than anything he'd said before, because it was honest. He opened the box slowly. Inside, everything was where I remembered, perfectly arranged. He took out a small ratchet, the one with the red-taped handle, and placed it in front of me. I want you to have this, he said. It's not much, but it's something real. Something that's been used, misused, and now maybe passed on better. I picked it up, not because I needed it, but because I understood what it cost him to offer it. The ratchet was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just holding everything that came with it. I looked up and said only one thing. I'm not angry anymore. He nodded once, then stepped back. No promises, no demands. Just a man who had finally stopped pretending his silence was strength. As he turned to leave, I said his name. He paused. You still have time, I said. Not to make it right, but to make it honest, he didn't look back. But I saw the way his shoulders dropped just slightly, like something inside him had finally been set down. When the door closed behind him, I placed the ratchet on the bench next to the schematic my students had been working on. They stood quietly nearby, watching. This, I said, tapping the red handle, isn't just a tool. They leaned in. It's a mistake, a lesson, and a second chance. And then I handed it to the youngest girl in the group. Use it better than he did, and better than I almost didn't. She took it carefully, like it mattered. And maybe now, it finally did. Every Tuesday morning, the shop smells like cold steel and coffee that's been sitting too long. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. And after everything I've walked through, that's more than enough. This morning, 6 women stand in front of me, each one in coveralls. Boots still stiff, names stitched onto uniforms that haven't yet absorbed the weight of real work. Some of them were Marines. One worked logistics for the Air Force. Another fixed tank treads in Afghanistan. Now they're here, learning how to listen to engines instead of orders, learning how to trust their hands again. I don't introduce myself with a resume. I don't talk about the Navy or my rank or what I've survived. Instead, I start with the one truth most people never teach. Machines don't care how loud you talk, I tell them. They care how well you listen. They shift, glancing at one another, some unsure, some already interested. I kneel beside the open engine rig at the center of the shop, a stripped-down propulsion core from an old supply vessel we rebuilt from scrap. Everyone thinks engineering is about control, I say. But machines don't obey commands. They respond to balance. One of the younger students, Brielle, raises a hand. What if something doesn't sound wrong, but it feels off? I smile at that. She's closer than she knows. That's when you stop looking for the problem on the screen and start listening to it in the silence. I stand and hand her a small brass rod, old, dulled from use. Put one end here, I instruct, pointing to the turbine casing. The other end to your ear. Tell me what you hear. She does as I say. Her brow furrows. It's rhythmic, but there's a tick. Low, every few seconds. I nod. And what does that tell you? She hesitates. Something's misaligned. Exactly. I don't tell her how I used to do the same thing in a hangar full of doubters. How I stood in silence while others laughed because I could hear what they couldn't. That story isn't for now. It's been told. And it doesn't need retelling when the lesson lives in hands like hers. We move on to diagnostics. I watch how they trace wiring harnesses, how they learn not to force a stuck bolt but coax it, how they measure temperature and touch, not just numbers. No one here is trying to impress me. They're trying to understand. And that makes all the difference. Later during lunch, I sit near the back wall looking over a student's handwritten notes. The handwriting is messy but determined, like mine once was. On the wall above me hangs a framed copy of the original Barracuda schematic, the one they tried to erase. No plaque, no explanation, just the lines, just the truth. One of the students, an older woman named Tanya, sits beside me. Is that yours? She asks, nodding at the blueprint. It was, I say. She studies it a moment longer. It's beautiful. Not flashy, but solid. I nod. I built it in silence, lost it in noise, and earned it back by staying still long enough for people to hear what they ignored the first time. She doesn't ask for more. She doesn't need to. That's the thing about legacy. It's not about being remembered. It's about being used. It's in every bolt turned by someone who never knew your name but followed your line. It's in every whisper passed from one set of hands to another, telling them, don't rush. Listen. By the end of the day, the students pack up their tools. Their hands are greasy, their faces tired, but their eyes carry something different. Not fear, not doubt. Just the quiet confidence of someone who's beginning to trust the silence again. As the door closes behind them, I walk to the turbine and run my hand along the casing. It hums soft, steady, balanced. Still running, still true. I don't speak to it. I never needed to. Because long before anyone believed in me, before any board cleared my name, before any engineer whispered that I was right, this machine listened to me. And now, so do they. The letter came in a standard issue Navy envelope. No ceremony, no brass seal. Just my name typed in bold across the front, Commander Avery Lockhart, Rhett. It arrived 3 days after Tanya's class finished their diagnostics module. 3 days after one of them asked me, so what happened with the Barracuda? And I just said it ran. I didn't open it right away. Letters like this don't arrive by mistake. And they don't just bring news. They bring the past with them. I waited until the evening, after the shop lights were turned off, after the clinking tools and laughter faded. Only the hum of the backup generator filled the air as I sat down at my old drafting desk, the one with oil stains and a small burn mark in the corner, where I once dropped a soldering iron during my second year as a naval apprentice. I opened it slowly. The letter inside was handwritten on heavy paper. Dark ink. The kind of penmanship you only see from people who take silence seriously. It read, Commander Lockhart. I've reviewed the board's findings. Your original schematic has been restored to the Naval Archives. The adjusted documents have been archived separately, with full notation of the discrepancies and chain of approval. As of this date, your record is no longer marked with operational failure. But more than that, I wanted to speak to the kind of officer you've always been. In my years of command, I've seen sailors win with noise, with politics, with performance. But this is the first time I've seen someone win with stillness. You didn't fight with rank. You didn't retaliate with blame. You reclaimed the truth by staying aligned with the machine you once built. For that and more, I'm proud to restore your Technical Officer's Commission, along with your Senior Engineering Certification, effective immediately. Should you ever choose to return, the Navy will welcome you. If not, then I hope wherever you serve next, silence continues to carry your name forward. Geneva R. Parks, Vice Admiral, United States Navy. I read it once, then again, and again slower, the third time, letting each sentence settle like a pressure reading. Senior Engineering Certification, restored, not requested, not begged for, not even needed, just offered. Folded inside the envelope was the formal document, embossed, signed, stamped. Official. And I could have framed it, hung it on the wall beside the blueprint, let it declare what 1,000 whispered dismissals once tried to erase. But I didn't. I placed it in the drawer with my original draft notes, right next to the schematic Avery 1.0 full of pencil marks and taped corners. Because that certificate doesn't define me, not anymore. It doesn't make the machine hum. It doesn't teach these women how to listen. It doesn't repair the moments I spent staring at a design I believed no one else would ever trust again. What makes me whole is knowing this. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to win in the court of public opinion. I didn't even need to be right out loud. I just needed to keep walking, to keep building, to keep teaching others to trust the quiet beneath the noise. Geneva understood that. She always did. Even when the rest of the board flinched under pressure, she saw through the silence and answered with her own. Later that night, I wrote back. 1 page, typed. No salutation, no rank. Just this: I won't return. I'm already where I belong. The engine runs now, not because of validation, but because I never stopped listening to it. I'll keep building new ones here. Quietly. Avery, I printed it, signed it, and mailed it without a second thought. Sometimes legacy isn't about the things you fix. It's about what you refuse to break. And for the first time in years, I closed the drawer, turned off the light, and walked out of the shop knowing the silence was never my enemy. It was always my blueprint. The room was quiet again, but not empty. Light filtered through the workshop's east window, the same one I'd installed myself with reinforced glass, not for protection, but because I liked the way it caught the early morning sun. It shimmered across the room over workbenches, blueprints, and gears, then landed gently on the frame design on my wall. I walked toward it without rush. My hand steady now rested on the glass. Behind it, my original schematic, clean, precise, untouched by politics. It had been recovered, verified, respected. But it wasn't the certificate that made it matter. It was the silence it survived. Underneath the frame, I had written a single line in pencil. No fanfare, no plaque. Just this, not because of who I am, but because I know what I did. I stood there for a moment, letting the words settle. I thought about the years I spent believing silence meant defeat, that not fighting back made me complicit, that walking away was the same as surrender, but it wasn't. It was breathing, it was healing. It was protecting the part of me that still believed in the work and machines that didn't lie in systems that held memory and truth, that waited until I was ready to speak again. Behind me, I could hear the students returning. Chatter footsteps, the creak of stools being pulled out. A wrench dropped. Someone whispered a joke, laughter, the class had begun. And I didn't need to command it. It ran because it believed. I turned just enough to see them from the corner of my eye. Every face focused. Every pair of hands already busy. Not on fixing things, but understanding them. Not on shouting over one another, but listening to engines to equations, and to the quiet parts of themselves they thought had been silenced for too long. I walked back to the front of the room. There was no need for a lecture today, no need for a declaration. Instead, I placed both hands flat on the table, looked at them, and said, "Machines don't need you to speak loudly. They need you to listen deeply." That was it. No applause, no music, just the humming of purpose returning to the room. And as I sat down beside the open blueprint again, I allowed myself to feel the stillness. Not emptiness, but stillness. There's a difference. And in that stillness, I thought of my father not as a commander, but as a man who once held a toolkit and forgot how to use it. I didn't need him to say my name with pride. I just needed him to stop mistaking me for someone else. Someone unworthy. Someone loud. Someone broken. He knows better now, and maybe that's enough. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like mine keep you company? Let me know in the comments. We read every single one with real gratitude. And if my story touched something in you, please consider subscribing, not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and the power of a second chance. Thank you truly for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, the miracle doesn't always knock. It waits quietly until you're ready to open the door from the inside. Take care. I'll see you in the next story.